Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven and I'm joined tonight by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, it's nice to see you again. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not doing too bad. I also had some my own technical issues on my end as well, so it's going well so far. Good start.
Coming up tonight, new polling of Labour members shows the party in a perilous situation. An oil company wins a punitive lawsuit against Greenpeace, and James O'Brien almost has a political epiphany. Israel has intensified its attacks on Gaza, with the country's defense minister laying bare its military strategy. Israel Katz has threatened to annex territory in Gaza and promised the Strip will come under permanent Israeli military control unless Hamas releases its hostages. Hamas have, of course, expressed their willingness to continue releasing hostages according to the terms of the original ceasefire deal. That, by the way, is the ceasefire that Israel routinely flouted before ripping it up earlier this week. Israel wants Hamas to accept a new proposal, one that doesn't include withdrawal of IDF forces from the Gaza Strip. This is from Israel Katz's statement. If the Hamas terror organization continues to refuse to release the hostages, I instructed the IDF to capture additional areas, evacuate the population, and expand the security zone around Gaza for the protection of Israeli communities and IDF soldiers through a permanent hold of the area by Israel. As long as Hamas continues its refusal, it will lose more and more land that will be added to Israel. At the United Nations today, the US backed up that Israeli account of who's to blame for the end of the ceasefire. Acting US ambassador to the UN told the Security Council this: Hamas bears full responsibility for the ongoing war in Gaza and for the resumption of hostilities. Every death would have been avoided had Hamas accepted the bridge proposal that the United States offered last Wednesday. So just to get that straight, a ceasefire had been signed, had been agreed. Hamas followed every part of it correctly. Israel decided, actually, no, we don't like the deal that we signed up to. So they offered them a new deal on poorer terms, which naturally they've said they don't want to do. They signed up to an original ceasefire. And now the US is saying anyone who's killed in Gaza by Israel, it's Hamas's fault because they haven't agreed to some cooked up new deal that gives Palestinians in the enclave a worse deal. Here's part of a statement Hamas issued in response to this absolutely crazy situation. In response to the biased statement of the US National Security Advisor, which equates the executioner with the victim and fully adopts the occupation's narrative, the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, affirms the following. Talking about Israel's right to defend itself is a blatant distortion of reality. The occupier does not have the right to defend its occupation. Rather, it is the aggressor in the first place. The ongoing Zionist aggression against our people for decades and the crimes of genocide in Gaza are what call for condemnation and accountability, not justification and support. The claim that Hamas chose war over releasing the hostages is a distortion of the facts. The Palestinian resistance presented clear initiatives for a ceasefire and a comprehensive prisoner exchange deal, but the occupation, led by Netanyahu, rejected them and deliberately sabotaged them to achieve its own political interests, as acknowledged by the leaders of its own security services. Now, that's a reference to the leader of Israel's security service currently having been summarily dismissed by the Netanyahu government, and that is itself the subject of a lawsuit against Netanyahu in Israel at the moment. The Israeli military seems to have begun making good on Israel Katz's threat to annex more land in Gaza, with tanks and troops entering the enclave as they push forward with a fresh ground operation. That's on top of a brutal bombing campaign that began earlier this week, as well as the aid blockade that's been in place since early March. This was the moment Israeli forces destroyed the Turkish Friendship Hospital, the enclave's only cancer hospital in central Gaza today.
Bam! That's it!
I had really hoped that we had seen the end of scenes like that. It really takes me back to the early stages of the war, early 2024, and this sense of just, not just us, not just you and me, but Palestinians having to go through all of that again, which is what looks like is going to happen, and perhaps even worse with Trump's proposal to just ethnically cleanse Palestinians from the Strip. In other words, pressurize them with bombing until they agree to go. So much a worse outcome than what was imagined even at the beginning of this war. It's unbelievable what Palestinians in Gaza have to endure, and in the West Bank, of course. Gazan medical authorities say more than 590 Palestinians have been killed since Israel resumed its full-intensity assault on Monday, including more than 200 children. And the intense bombing, which began this week, is the next stage of what the Israeli government has called a, quote, hell plan to force further hostage releases without the withdrawal of Israeli ground forces. Here's Emily Thornberry, Labour MP, of all people, pushing back against claims that it's Hamas that has collapsed the deal.
Now, what happened was that we got to the 1st of March and the Israelis unilaterally, as far as I can see, said, we're not going into phase 2. We want to just stay on phase 1. We want to just keep having more hostages and releasing prisoners. We're not prepared to talk about moving out of Gaza, nor are we prepared to talk about a future for Gaza. And the reason for that is because Netanyahu is clinging on to power by his fingernails. He has to pass a budget at the end of March, and he has to pass that budget in order to continue the government that he's in charge of. And if he isn't in charge of the government in Israel, he personally gets into a great deal of trouble. There are court cases swirling around him, there are inquiries and everything else.
Now, while it's certainly true that Netanyahu has strong political and personal motivations to extend the war for as long as possible, this is about more than just one man. Research by Israel's Direct Polls Institute, published by Israeli Channel 14 just before the IDF resumed carpet bombing Gaza on Monday night, found that 59% of Israelis supported a return to fighting. However, there is also an active and growing anti-war movement in Israel. In recent days, thousands have been protesting in Tel Aviv, and activists have also clashed with police near Prime Minister Netanyahu's home in Jerusalem. Now, Defense Minister Katz's statement threatening annexation came 2 days after he released a video specifically threatening civilians. In that video, we showed it yesterday, he said, either you turn on Hamas, you release the hostages, or you will bear the brunt of our bombing. So it doesn't matter whether you know where they are, doesn't matter if you've got anything to do with Hamas, you get those hostages out, you put pressure on Hamas, otherwise you will be killed in huge numbers by us. And today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised even further escalation.
We have agreed on the military plan to go back to an intensified operation against Hamas. From now on, the negotiations will only continue under fire. I promise, this is only the beginning. We'll continue to fight to achieve our goals.
This is only the beginning. I do not know how South Africa's lawyers for the ICJ case against Israel managed to keep up a running tally of the really insane genocidal rhetoric that continues to pour out of Israeli officials. They're not even scared. They're just very happy to say it out loud. Meanwhile, in interviews with Western media, spokespeople for the Israeli government continue to insist that civilians are never targeted. This was Israeli ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotovely, on Sky News.
Figures, according to the health ministry run by Hamas, say that more than 400 people were killed in airstrikes by Israel this week. What is your response to that?
I share this sadness that I see on your face about the human tragedy that Hamas is creating. Hamas has the direct fault for this. You need to understand, Israel never targets civilians. And we're in a point where Hamas uses these people as human shields, as you all know, and it's doing it in the most cynical way to make sure you will report it in Sky News, to make sure that Israel will look like it's harming civilians when we never harm civilians.
I share the sadness I see on your face. And yet, you're part of a government that has literally told Palestinians that they're going to bomb them unless they, civilians, get these hostages released. There's no sadness there, none. The only emotion I ever see in Tzipi Hotovely is something like triumph, actually. And there she's doing a good job kind of masking it. But yeah, I mean, it's actually sickening. Let's move on. So what is there even left to say at this point? It's hard to believe that anyone paying attention finds anything that Hotovely says credible, as well as the many examples of Israeli politicians directly threatening war crimes. There's extensive video evidence of IDF soldiers committing them and admitting them. And there are testimonies from dozens of Western doctors and nurses who volunteered in Gaza saying they saw children targeted by snipers on a daily basis. That's children, sometimes even toddlers, with precisely placed gunshots to the head and heart. How are they human shields? Often they're just standing in the middle of a street. They're not near any building, they're not near any other people, and they're just targeted by snipers and killed. Despite all this evidence, the only possible justification for current UK policy, in both a legal and moral sense, is that none of it's actually happening. They think none of it's actually happening. When Keir Starmer says it's up to the courts to determine if Israel is breaching international human rights law and that he couldn't possibly comment, he can't say, he's suggesting there's some alternative plausible interpretation under which Israel is not using UK-manufactured aircraft components to commit war crimes. And let's not forget that the International Criminal Court already has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And hopefully it'll be Israel Katz next, for war crimes and crimes against humanity. What's more, while the ICJ genocide trial is still ongoing, in a preliminary finding, the court found it, quote, plausible Israel's actions could amount to genocide. Now, let's take a slightly more detailed look at what has actually been happening in Gaza in these last few days as this war, or as this genocidal assault on the enclave resumes. In an article by a Gazan journalist published by Israeli magazine Plus 972, he describes just one of the many massacres committed in Gaza in the last week. He's used a fake name to protect himself from Israeli reprisals. Here's an extract from a conversation the journalist had with a witness to that bombing, Odeh Al-Zai. I removed a large stone that had fallen on my mother's chest, grabbed her hand and pulled her downstairs, Al-Zai recounted. Right outside our front door, there was half of a woman's body. My mother fainted. As Al-Zai took in the scale of the destruction around him, he saw more dismembered bodies scattered on the street. Together with his neighbors, he gathered up the various body parts and put them in plastic bags on the sidewalk. The smell of blood and decaying flesh attracted stray dogs to the area, he explained, in tears. For 2 hours, we threw stones at them and guarded the bodies until a single ambulance arrived. But they only had space to take the wounded. They refused to take the dead bodies. Helena, I said earlier in the show that it felt like a return to early 2024. The messaging from Israel is the same, if not, in fact, even worse. They're being much more open about what they intend for Gaza. They're obviously extremely buoyed by Donald Trump being in the White House. The only small change that I saw was that interview with Emily Thornberry, where there was some pushback against the Israeli narrative of what's going on in Gaza. Do you think that the reason for that is that it's just too blindingly obviously false, or could it actually indicate some small change in UK policy towards Israel?
Well, Emily Thornberry has the freedom of no longer being a government minister, because obviously she was in the shadow cabinet, but she's now just a backbencher. She does chair the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, but that does give her a lot more kind of freedom, in the same way that Alicia Kearns, when she was chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee beforehand, to be able to be more open in terms of the reality that's on the ground. Remember, Alicia Kearns was very strong in getting David Cameron to admit that Gaza is, in international legal terms, occupied by Israel, despite the claims that you get from pro-Zionist commentators that because of the unilateral disengagement protocol in 2005, it's no longer occupied, which isn't true. It is still, in legal terms, occupied by Israel, and therefore is subject to the rules regarding resistance to occupation. And of course, as you say, things have they're far worse, the statements that we hear now. The level to which that Israel has been emboldened by the election of Donald Trump and the foreign policy of his administration means that they are being open in their desires for colonization and for annexation and for ethnic cleansing. They realize that there is nobody to hold them to account anymore, because the only people who can do are their allies, who refuse to do so. They refuse to actually properly condemn them, even when David Lammy says the truth, which is that they are breaching international law. His own government makes actions to gag him in terms of that regard, to get him to roll back those comments. And as I said, it's just the worst thing about being on the left is we get proven right too early. Well, we are right too early, and when we get proven right, nobody believes us. You know, when we were saying that the long scale reason that Netanyahu was engaging in the genocidal and ethnic cleansing campaign that he has done, the entire point of the military engagement by the IDF in Gaza was to try and annex as much territory as possible, because that's all they understand, is the desire to colonize what they see as Judea and Samaria, as the land under Zionist orthodoxy that they have the divine right to be able to own under the Israeli ethno-state. We said from the start this would be their end goal, is the annexation of Gaza and continuing their annexation and settlement within the West Bank. This is exactly what they've done. And rather than being plausibly deniable about that, rather than engaging in plausible deniability about their intentions, with the emboldening of the election of Donald Trump, they will openly say, we are just going to take your land and it will become part of Israel. They openly say it now to engage in their idea of maintaining and expanding the ethno-state of Israel and kicking out Gazans and kicking out Palestinians from the internationally recognized state of Palestine, which is obviously flagrantly a violation of international law. We said this would happen. People told us that we were over the top, that this wasn't true and they were being I'm sorry, it's obvious. It was obvious from the start, and it should be even obvious now that Israel Katz is openly suggesting that should be the case. And I just want to make a comparison here. When we look at Ukraine, when we look at the oblasts that Vladimir Putin is claiming that he wants to annex, which is Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, and of course, there is now a negotiation over the potential ending of that conflict. And a lot of people are saying there is the inevitability that Russia is going to want to push for annexation of at least part of those oblasts to maintain the land border between Crimea and the Rostov Oblast. And the mention of this and the Trump administration's capitulation to Vladimir Putin's desires to annex this territory has immediately caused so much consternation in liberal ranks at the idea that the Ukrainians would give up land to Russia. This is, as far as I'm concerned, rightly described as capitulation. It's rightly described that the Ukrainians have every right to be able to ensure that they can reclaim the territory that Russia wants to take from them. Do you hear the same level of consternation from those same people about the land that Israel wants to steal from the Palestinians? No, you don't see a single word of it, despite the fact that they are just as open, Netanyahu and Israel Katz and all the other expansionist members of the Israeli government, they all are very open about their desire to colonize and expand their territory into Gaza and the West Bank. Do you hear the same level of condemnation? Do you hear it described as capitulation by the Palestinians to maintain that, to get some sort of peace deal or to continue the ceasefire? No, you don't hear a single word. You don't hear a single word. All you hear is October the 7th, Hamas are the terrorists, Israel has a right to defend itself, ad infinitum. They don't recognize the reality of the Zionist project with regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict. They do not recognize it because they're the good team, right? They're allied with the rest. They're allied with the West. Therefore, they must be the people that we support, and we will ignore their terrible actions. We've been open on this channel of condemning things like attacks on civilians by Palestinian resistance forces. We've been open in saying that we want to see peace in the region. But at the very least, we understand that when Israel breaks international law, when Israel tries to annex territory, which is grave violations of international law, when it murders children, which is what the IDF is being done, as we've seen, the snipers attacks on little children, we at least call it out. We at least call it out and want to get our government to take material action to be able to stop that, because that's the thing we have control over. Yet liberals out there who are looking now at open calls for annexation of territory, will they realise that they didn't understand the reality of what was being pushed for by the IDF and the Israeli government? No, they will say they didn't know, and they will cover their hands and they will refuse to admit that they were wrong. And that's the problem, is that we could see from the start this was where we would end up. And the lack of action from our own government and from the US government, of course, under Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, who gave them a green light to do that, must shoulder a huge amount of this blame amongst other Western governments as well, who saw this, who could understand the genocidal calls coming from inside the house from day one, from October the 8th onwards, and they refused to act. And this is why we're here right now.
That is exactly why we're here right now. And I want to just extend that comparison you made with Ukraine, because it's a very, very good one. Because another thing to think about is that there are a bunch of countries in Europe, who are now rearming because they think that Putin's record shows that if he takes territory in Ukraine, he won't stop there. He will go on and try to take territory in other parts of Europe. Nobody ever thinks that about Israel. No one ever thinks, oh, actually, Israel is a land-grabbing state, despite the fact that at various points in its history, it has occupied or annexed land from Lebanon, from Jordan, from Syria, and even from Egypt. So, yeah, the way in which we think about Russia, which in fact actually, has had various incursions into other countries, but hasn't really made territorial gains, as opposed to Israel, which has, as I say, but still has a next, part of Syria. I think you're absolutely right. And as you say, people who are concerned about Russia's theoretical expansionist motives don't consider for a minute Israel's actually proclaimed expansionist motives. New polling conducted by Survation for Labourists has found that almost half of Labour members think the party is heading in the wrong direction. 49% said they're unhappy with the direction of travel, which is more than the 40% who said they're pleased with it. And 1 in 8 respondents said they're unsure how they'll vote in the next election. Just to remind you, this is Labour members, and 1 in 8 of them don't know whether they'll vote for the party they belong to in the next election. And it's worth noting that the polling took place between the 4th and the 18th of March. So it'll have been somewhat inflected by the recent savage cuts to welfare that Liz Kendall has made, but not completely influenced by it. Helena, are you surprised by this result? And do you think it's going to worry Starmer?
I don't really see much surprising out of what we're seeing here. We're seeing huge people leave the Labour Party in droves. I don't know if you've lost count. I know I have, of the amount of posts that I've seen, the amount of public statements that I've seen from members of the Labour Party saying, this is not the party that I signed up for. I mean, to be fair, there was plenty of us who saw the writing on the wall. There were plenty of us who, years and years ago, it's years since I've been a member of the Labour Party, or at least have relations to it, being a member of an affiliated trade union. And we've seen all of these. I've left early. I saw the writing on the wall. I saw what's happening internally. I saw the kind of people who were gaining traction in the party. I saw the things that were being put together by Labour together. The people who have the control over internal policy at the top of the party. It shouldn't be surprising that people feel, who are Labour members, who are obviously traditionally to the left of the leadership, but the basic principles that the Labour Party should stand for, like protecting the sick and disabled, being violated in front of everybody by Liz Kendall's draconian reforms towards the eligibility criteria for PIP, for example, and going, I can't be a part of this anymore. And for these people to think I might not be able to vote Labour at the next election, sure, some of them might be saying, well, I have to tactically vote for a different party in my seat, but a large portion of these people, and again, these are the ones that are still there, who haven't left already, who are, teetering on the edge of considering not even voting for the party that they're a member of. And, that's what happens when the leadership takes their own membership for granted in terms of the policy they want to see, in terms of, sharing the same kind of values, and on a basic level, allowing these people to participate in party democracy, which has been something that's also been shuttered out. What's the Labour Party continue to vote for at conference? Proportional representation, all of these other things like continued nationalisations, and does the actual party, when they're in government, when they have dictatorial power with a giant majority to do whatever they want, do they actually do what the members vote for at conference? No. Do members get to pick their own candidates at the election? No. They have no power. They have no influence over what happens. And they're seeing a party that doesn't represent their values undermine and destroy Labour's branding in the eyes of the public. And I bet quite a lot of these people feel embarrassed to be members of the party at this point in time.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't be telling anybody if I was a card-carrying member of this sad sack party. Let's go on to some more results. Party members were also asked what result they expected at the next general election. As you can see, they're mostly expecting Labour will remain in government, but only 6% think they'll get another big majority. 43% expect a small Labour majority, and 24% expect a hung parliament with Labour as the largest party. Interestingly, 5% expect a hung parliament with Reform winning the most seats, and 3% are predicting an outright Reform win. Based on that, you won't be surprised to learn which party Labour members see as Labour's biggest electoral threat. As you can see, Labour members are relatively united on this one. 71% think Reform is the biggest threat to Labour's election chances. Only 3% are more concerned about the Greens challenging them from the left. I think that's very interesting, Helena, that they see Reform as more of a threat than the Greens. Is that because Labour members are in generally just kind of brained in this way that says, look, the left can never be a threat. It can only come from the right. Or do you think it's the case that actually the left doesn't pose a threat and that Reform is actually the only game in town now?
I think it's true in both cases, in that the left isn't a threat, but this is part and parcel of the fact that people perceive them not to be, you know? So there's a real self-fulfilling prophecy if you don't believe that there is a legitimate project outside of the left. You saw this in return in the run-up to the election last year. You saw the run-up to the election, the line from people whose sole motivation with regards to how they were going to vote at the last election was just get the Tories out. It's first past the post. You have to vote tactically. You have to vote for Labour or Lib Dems in whichever constituency that it is to keep the Tories out. And there is no long-term project to try and push the Overton window to the left by threatening Labour with electoral consequences for there being a Green Party candidate or a Workers' Party candidate or a Socialist Independent candidate in second place. Regardless of how you feel about those independents or those parties, there is at least a push if they do feel like they're having their the electoral gains threatened through there being an alternative, a real progressive alternative in these seats, then they have no reason to court these people's votes, right? And this is a part and parcel. This is a real consequence of the tactical vote campaign people weren't tactically voting for the Greens in all of these London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Bristol, apart from Bristol constituencies, really, Bristol's the only area which had a really large Green vote as a proportion of second place finishes in the constituency. So Labour know that in a lot of these seats where a lot of progressive voters are, which are urban and progressive and full of younger people, university towns and things like that, there's no threat. There's no real threat because there's a large cohort of people who'll just vote Labour no matter how right-wing they go. No matter how many things that Labour Party does bad, these people have been entirely sold on the narrative that they must vote for Labour, otherwise they get the Tories. So there's this binary choice, apart from the fact that the Labour Party were a nothing party before 1910, and it was only because people actually voted for them, regardless of the electoral consequences, to try and usurp the Liberals. You have to vote for a party at one point to be able to get them to be a proper challenger. And because this is no actual challenger, because of this myopic voting strategy that the people who are slight liberal left or progressive have enacted at the last election, all you have is right-wings who voted for reform regardless because they saw no alternative elsewhere throughout swathes of Labour heartlands where you don't really see progressive challengers doing particularly well. So there is a threat to Labour in areas where people have abandoned them because they have done ever since 1997. In a post-industrial world, a lot of these areas of the country have been completely decimated, and Labour never really offered them anything throughout the Blair years, chasing middle-class swing seat votes. So these are areas like the North East, areas in the Red Wall, areas in the West Midlands, for example, or areas in Wales, these post-industrial communities, there's a big cohort of reform voters because they didn't feel like they have anything to lose by voting reform, unlike the people who were sold on the tactical vote. So there is an electoral consequence coming from the right that isn't coming from the left. And obviously, since Labour realised that mechanically in terms of the elections, they're going to offer policy to Reform UK voters. So that moves the Overton window to the right, and therefore more people see Reform UK's rhetoric being given credence through Labour's policy making and through their narrative and through their strategy, which encourages more people to support right-of-centre politics. So that's why it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and why it is both true that there isn't a progressive challenger, and that it is, and because that's the reason why that there has been this increase in the threat of reform.
Yeah, and important to say as well about those post-industrial heartlands, they're repeatedly betrayed politically. They're sort of, something is offered as a hope, they'll swing towards it, and then they're just abandoned again. Brexit made absolutely no difference. The Tories, absolutely no difference. Labour just cutting the welfare bill on which many people might depend, and they'll swing to reform, but reform is absolutely guaranteed not to be on their side. And the trouble is, there is actually no party that is on their side. There is actually no party that cares about those communities in England, at least. And yeah, we need that urgently, don't you think?
I mean, I do think that there is a party that is on their side. I think that the Green Party's platform, again, I am biased, full disclosure, I am a Green Party member. I know I've mentioned it quite a lot recently, but we've been talking about the struggles of the Labour Party and going to the right. So I've been in the position to have to make these points quite often, but I promise I'm not a Green Party political broadcast here. But I think it's worth pointing out that in the last election, the Green Party stood on a platform that advocated for nationalising the steel industry, for example. We want to make sure we save the steel jobs and invest government money into green steel, even if it is overall loss making for both the security of these communities, these post-industrial communities where these jobs have gone. And we want to invest money through industrial strategy to keep the steel jobs in the UK. So it's better for the environment because we're making it home, or we're using electric arc furnaces to try and recycle steel so these industries can be alive in a more kind of green manner, or by upgrading into green steel through government investment, but also through large state subsidies, public subsidies for state-owned energy in the green energy sector to provide these post-industrial communities with more jobs, more green industrial jobs that are done in the UK to avoid all of the problems that we have with post-industrial decline, and of course to be more environmentalist in terms of not having to do these things overseas, which have large shipping costs, which are bad for the environment too, and we can make them more environmentally friendly at home. So I believe that there are a lot of things that can be offered to these communities from the Green Party, but because there isn't enough people on the ground, because people don't see this as an alternative, we don't really have people in those communities out there doing outreach. Even if the policies are there, we don't really have the electoral base there at the moment. I think that is the problem. But I think the policy that we have broadly at the moment is something that would be positive if we could reach out to these people.
Yeah, I'm still going to take a little bit of convincing. And I think this is like probably a little bit of a trauma, because, you know, the last time I saw a party kind of move into an area where there was where Labour had left a kind of vacancy in terms of the left, or in terms of issues that were close to my heart as a left-wing person, was in 2010 when the Lib Dems did it. And I guess I sort of worry that there's a kind of potential repetition here with, you know, a kind of industrial strategy having been put forward by the Greens, but quite late in the day, only reasonably recently, doesn't make me completely confident about who they are. But I am prepared to be convinced. Personally, I would like to see a new left party as soon as possible. Survation also asked Labour members whether they had a favourable or unfavourable opinion of each Labour cabinet minister, and produced the following league table. I'm not particularly surprised to see Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall at the bottom there. Kendall is, of course, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and the face of the devastating disability benefits cuts. You might remember when she ran for leader in 2015 on a similar sort of platform and got 4.5% of the vote. So everyone has always hated Liz Kendall. And next week, Rachel Reeves is expected to announce spending cuts of up to 7% for some departments. It's interesting, though, that Wes Streeting, who is rumoured to be the Labour Right's preferred candidate to replace Starmer when he goes, isn't particularly popular with members either. Slightly less popular than Starmer himself, in fact. So yeah, good work there, Wes. At the top, you've got Ed Miliband and Angela Rayner, the most left-wing members of the current cabinet, which, to be fair, isn't saying that much. Helena, is this about what you'd expect from Labour members? And do you think it will bother the party leadership that key figures are so disliked?
Yeah, I don't think this is surprising in the slightest. I think that there's always been true that people have generally been more left-wing in the Labour membership, even given how many people have left now. Even the ones that are still there. I really hate Wes Streeting. I mean, he's a contemptible figure in my mind, regardless, so it doesn't do himself any favours. Neither does Liz Kendall, of course. I think the Rachel Reeves figures are surprising, given that, of course, I think that she does not do a lot of what Labour members want, but she's hardly been as directly confrontational with their interests as, you know, the private healthcare donations receiver Wes Streeting, or the disability benefit revoker Liz Kendall, right? I think her problems are pretty small fry in comparison to Wes and Liz. I do find it interesting. Of course, Ed Miliband and Angela Rayner are the two most popular. Now, whilst Ed Miliband still carries the scars from 2010 till 2015, actually, when you look at Angela Rayner in terms of the broader population, if you look at Labour voters, for example, rather than Labour members, and the more in common polling, Angela Rayner is still the most popular amongst those people too. So even outside of the membership, the kind of people who are likely to vote Labour, they all like Angela Rayner as well. She actually has a lot more appeal than just her policy prescriptions in terms of why Labour members like her, because she's on the left of the party. But she has broad appeal across the country because, you know, she's a normal person. Like, despite our misgivings with her kind of betrayal of the left, quote unquote, within the Labour movement, you know, at the very least in terms of what she represents politically, she is somebody who speaks her mind, who is down to earth, who speaks the same language as many people in the country that are outside of the PMC bubble that the Westminster elite live in. And she's lived a normal life. She's struggled. She's been successful in overcoming those struggles. And she is somebody who is completely unashamed of the fact that She came from a poor background and she represents those backgrounds politically, Now, I feel like that she's undermined that through the way in which she's engaged in terms of not pushing back against the regressive policies of the current administration. But at the very least, she has this kind of broad appeal that a bunch of people in Labour really just don't. At a time when the level to which the political class in this country are removed from the lives of everyday people, that's a life that Angela Rayner has lived in, grown up in a council house, which you can't say for many other people in government right now. And so with regards to how the leadership feel about this, I think what we're probably going to see is more desire to try and start not rigging, but trying to change the leadership contest rules to ensure that they are the ones who get to choose who it is. They previously proposed this idea of a Liz Truss lock, which essentially stops members from choosing a leader when the party is in government. So that means they can just keep chopping and changing leader whenever they want, as long as they're in government, to ensure that it's only the PLP who get to choose who that is. I don't know whether that's actually going to come into force or not. It'd be difficult to push it through against the members, but with so few ones left that are actually on the left of the party, that might be not as difficult as it once was. But what that would involve would be making sure the PLP choose, and the PLP has all been directly chosen by the leadership because they rigged a bunch of selections by kicking out anybody to the left of like Gerhard Schroeder or something, So there really isn't an internal mechanism to hold the leadership to account, really, outside of, conference votes, I guess. If they want to make changes to the leadership rules to ensure that they get to impose who they want to be a leader in the future, regardless of what the members want. Although, to be fair, I don't think many members of the public like Wes Streeting either, so maybe they should probably leave that one be more moving forward. I'd certainly be very happy if they did.
Greenpeace has been ordered to pay an oil company $660 million for allegedly inciting people to protest a pipeline. The nonprofit was sued for defamation and encouraging criminal behavior in its support of the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. The protests were led by grassroots Native Americans who were resisting the construction of a pipeline that would threaten the water source and ancient burial grounds of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. The case was won by Dallas-based oil and gas company Energy Transfer, which, by the way, is worth almost $70 billion. The argument made by Energy Transfer is that disruptive protesters have been funded and trained by Greenpeace. Many activists, however, are concerned about the precedent this could set for free speech and our rights to protest against powerful corporations, with Greenpeace's senior legal advisor, Deepa Padmanabhan, stating this. We should be concerned about the future of the First Amendment and lawsuits like these aimed at destroying our rights to peaceful protest and free speech. Greenpeace will continue to do its part to fight for the protection of these fundamental rights for everyone. Now, Greenpeace will be appealing the decision, with their general counsel, Kristen Casper, saying the following. Energy Transfer hasn't heard the last of us in this fight. We're just getting started with our anti-SLAPP lawsuit against Energy Transfer's attack on free speech and peaceful protest. We will see Energy Transfer in court this July in the Netherlands. We will not back down. We will not be silenced. So the SLAPP lawsuits Casper is referring to there, that means the Strategic Laws Against Public Participation, involves multi-billion-dollar companies using their resources to bury ordinary people in legal fees and complex court cases, and totally silencing dissent as a result. Oil companies in particular have a history of using these very expensive and time-consuming lawsuits to crush environmental campaigners and other people attempting to criticize or expose corporate wrongdoing. And in this case, that is an acute risk, with Greenpeace stating that this payout could bankrupt their entire operation, meaning an end to 50 years of environmental campaigning. Concerns had also been expressed that Greenpeace would not be able to get a fair hearing in the case, which was being heard in North Dakota, a state where many rely on the oil industry for a living. More than half of the jurors selected to hear the case had ties to the fossil fuel industry, and the majority had pre-existing negative views of anti-pipeline protesters or anti-fossil fuel groups. So hardly a fair trial, right? There were also reports that propaganda mailers made to look like newspapers had been posted to the homes of local residents containing articles stigmatizing the pipeline protesters. However, the counsel to Energy Transfer, Trey Cox, called the outcome this: a day of celebration for the Constitution, the state of North Dakota, and energy transfer. A day of celebration now that free speech in a US state has been quashed. Helena, what do you make of this case? And what do you make of the idea of these corporations using these SLAPP lawsuits to silence dissent?
Well, it just shows you who runs America, doesn't it? It shows you who runs America, or who runs the world, really, at this point. It is entirely beholden to corporate interests in the, I guess, in a post-Citizens United world, especially in the United States. They essentially have more rights than people do. They have more rights than the earth does, than the environment does, certainly, because they get to push their negative externalities onto everybody else. And if you push back, they get to try and sue you in violation, in my mind, of, at least the basis on which the First Amendment was written, right? Of course, defamation falls outside of the First Amendment because this is civil, as far as I'm aware, rather than a legal battle because it's done through defamation courts. But regardless, it is still absolutely ridiculous that you claim these things. Essentially, bankrupts an entire operation over their desire to try and get people to join other protests, weren't even led by groups, led by the Native Americans themselves. Like, this is, again, it shows you where it gets you if you just continue to try and work within the system itself, when the system itself is set up against you. We have corporate power is who gets people elected in the United States. Corporate power is who backs all of the powerful candidates. Corporate power buys out political parties, and they have set up a political system that allows corporations to get away with anything they want, and people who push back then end up getting the force of the actual state itself coming against them to protect those interests, regardless of what happens internationally. This will have ramifications for the actions of Greenpeace internationally, as well as obviously in the United States. As the United States is their biggest operation. This is where they're going to have the most impact, because the United States is one of the biggest polluters in the world. If not one of, especially, it's definitely one of the biggest per capita in terms of kind of the OECD nations, of course. And so things like the Dakota Access Pipeline are things that had to be opposed. And you can't really oppose them when the actual ways in which they were getting pushed through in terms of the legislation to allow them to do so is being done by political parties and political entities that were beholden to the interests in the first place. They do not take into account the wishes of the broader population at large, or indeed the broader interests of the environment and the planet. So this is something that is a big problem in capitalism itself. It is a problem with the subsuming of resources within inside these fossil fuel and energy giants. And so what else can you do other than protest? Of course, money is only one thing. There will be other groups that will come up to be able to protest these things in future. There'll be other people who will be wanting to find other ways of being able to oppose this. But it's a very kind of dark future for American democracy as well, if essentially using slap lawsuits, which have been the preserve of the wealthy forever, to be able to, often in recent memory at the very least, to be able to weaponize their great wealth to silence little people. It shows you the kind of future, the grim future we're looking at, company towns and things like this, the kind of thing that's been pushed through by, or at least given the support of the current American administration. They're very happy. The Republican Party is very happy for there to be things of company towns, which essentially has their no state pushback. So rather than just having a state that is beholden to corporate interests, you essentially have a state created by corporate interests. And that is the only future that you get when you have no political entity out there to push back against corporate power.
Look, if you'd like to read more about resistance to the fossil fuel industry and the case for militant action against it, Andreas Malm has a great book on the topic. How to Blow Up a Pipeline is available via the Novara Media shop, and a cut from all sales goes towards supporting our journalism. Head to shop.novaramedia.com, and that link is in the description. LBC host James O'Brien is hardly amongst Britain's most radical political figures, but every now and again, he seems to get it. Almost.
Come here. Conspiracy theory. The closest I have ever come to a conspiracy theory was when Occupy Wall Street was kicking off. Do you remember when it really felt as if the status quo was under siege, that people were simply not going to tolerate a society in which some people have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds, and some people were using food banks. I reckon if you could plot those two timelines, the rise of Occupy Wall Street and calls for a really serious redistribution of wealth, just for a bit more fairness to be introduced into society, wealth taxes, all the rest of it, and the resurgence in racism when it comes to immigration, I think you'd see those two graphs were in lockstep with each other.
Almost clicking. So why is that a conspiracy theory? Look, we know at least one thing about the circumstances that give rise to both calls for wealth redistribution and anti-immigrant sentiment, and that's the presence of scarcity. Scarcity in housing, scarcity in access to the NHS, scarcity in well-paying jobs, and scarcity in security in general. Now, the Occupy movement arose in response to the 2008 financial crash and the economic austerity inflicted on populations by governments who used public funds to bail out a casino financial sector. So essentially, ordinary people were forced to pay for those bailouts to private capital by seeing the services that they relied on degraded or removed. And current calls for wealth redistribution in the form of wealth taxes come hot on the back of a massive hike in wealth inequality in the UK, largely caused by the wealthy accumulating assets and capital during the pandemic. Again, that was done through public money, with government furlough cash making its way into the pockets of the rich through rents and purchases, and then taken back from the public through tax rises and, again, cuts to public services. But is there a more direct connection between the super wealthy and anti-immigrant sentiment? This was friend of the show Gary Stevenson of Gary's Economics on Channel 4 earlier this month.
I never thought I would have to be talking about immigration. I'll be totally honest with you, I'm not an expert in immigration, right? That's not something that you learn about. You study economics at university. I've never considered it to be like a massive driving factor behind the UK economy. But I started to see about like 2 years ago, it coming in really aggressively, like, no, it's not the rich. The problem's not the rich. The problem is immigrants. The problem is immigrants. And at first it was a bit, and then it was a bit more, and then it was a bit more. And I was kind of thinking, where is this coming from? But I realized we're getting to a situation, I think we are in a situation now, where the number one thing which is preventing higher taxes on the rich is basically anti-immigrant sentiment. And that worried me because I realized immediately, I'm almost wary of saying this, if the rich find out that the number one thing preventing them from paying higher taxes is dislike of immigrants, they will start absolutely funding the shit out of it.
He said, funding the shit out of it there. Channel 4 bleeped it out. Now, you might think, as James O'Brien seems to, that sounds a little bit conspiratorial, you know, the rich funding anti-migrant sentiment. But Gary brought some receipts.
I feel okay saying this now. I didn't want to say it before because I didn't want rich people to be like, let's fund anti-immigrant sentiment. Let's fund anti-immigrant sentiment. The reason I feel okay saying it now is because we've got Elon Musk. You've got Elon Musk coming in, richest man in the world, aggressively supporting and funding anti-immigrant sentiment. And it makes total sense because if you're smart, you know that this economic situation gets worse. And it will. I guarantee you, it will get worse and worse and worse, significantly worse for ordinary people. And then you know we will have to have some sort of significant political change. And I think there are basically two leading voices in what we need to do. There's me and my lot saying tax the rich, but there's another voice which is much, much louder, which is the problem is immigrants. And if you are a billionaire, which one of those two do you want to win? So I'm not surprised at all to see Elon Musk coming in and really aggressively funding the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants.
Look, as every single politician knows, and as every person who's grown their wealth by fleecing ordinary folk truly understands, there is nothing more dangerous than a united working class. That's why you've got to divide it up all the time. You've got to create infighting. You've got to create opposition within that bloc in order to keep it electorally dysfunctional or electorally impotent. Here's one last bit from Gary.
You know, I think we have to accept that large levels of immigration may have affected, especially some groups of society negatively. And some, you know, I come from a poor background and I went to London School of Economics, very fancy university. I went to Oxford, I work in the city, I work in media now, like I published a book. These are all like very, you know, upper middle class spaces. If you allow to migrate, for example, a lot of manual workers, this affects the middle class who, you know, professor at university. If a load of plumbers and builders come in, and you're a university professor and you want a kitchen renovation, that affects you differently to somebody who is a plumber or a builder. And I think there's sometimes a frustrating lack of class awareness on this. I think we have to accept it. It will have affected some groups differently than others, and it might have affected some groups negatively. I think we have to accept that. But I don't think it's the main cause. You know, I don't think it's the main cause. The group of society which is getting massively richer is the rich. It is the super rich. These guys are getting really, really, really aggressively richer. And I think they are kind of cynically using this. I think they know. And for me, my plan is to unite the working class, to push back on this group of society that is taking their houses. And if people can be convinced to hate migrants, and in the extreme case, to hate people of colour, that makes my job impossible, because the British working class is extremely multiracial, multi-ethnic. So I really worry about this narrative growing.
I think there's a point there that Gary makes about how immigration may have affected some groups in society negatively, to the point that I think we maybe don't often want to make, as well as he says that there's a lack of class awareness about that, which I think is true. I think that's a really important one. And I think you can say that. Yeah, some parts of society have not benefited from immigration, while also saying that immigration has been an overall net economic positive for the UK, which is also true. It just means that the economic benefits of immigration, as with all things in a fundamentally unequal society, are distributed very unevenly across its parts. Helena, what did you think about what Gary said there? And do you think James O'Brien, if you watch that, he might finally get it?
So when it comes to the immigration effect, there are plenty of things that we can do to mitigate its negative effects. So as you said there, it can have effects if certain numbers of immigrants come and take certain kinds of jobs and certain sectors of society, which increases the supply, therefore reduces the actual value in relation to a similar amount of demand. Broadly, immigrants come into this country and take all kinds of jobs. They don't really have a labour market distortion in the way that a lot of people try to say that they do, because they increase demand and increase supply by being consumers as well as being labourers as well. And of course, the more working age people we have, the more people we have to pay pensions. If you didn't have migrants, there'd be loads of the taxation on the people who might be getting slightly higher wages before these labour market distortions. They're going to have to pay lots more in tax because there's fewer other people paying tax to fund the number of pensions that we have that isn't going down. That's only increasing over time. Obviously, you can take actions to be able to mitigate this, like a sectoral bargaining agreement. You know, if we had proper sectoral bargaining like they have, for example, in Nordic countries, if there was a labour market distortion because a certain kind of migrant was coming here that took a certain type of job in the economy, a sectoral bargaining agreement smooths out that labour market distortion, that wage arbitrage that you get by saying, you know, builders or plumbers, which actually we don't get that many. It's still actually a pretty lucrative career to work in the trades at this point, because a lot of people are coming and they're doing things in the service industry, which wages have been depressed. I think that if you had a sectoral bargaining agreement and you had more trade union membership, that would protect wages from the kind of distortions that you see from migration. But more to the point, with regards to James O'Brien, the thing is that the description of a conspiracy theory is this idea that anything that we can cause in a liberal mind is being caused through a direct desire to make it happen. Something's being directed. There's a puppet master in the background. That's what a conspiracy theory looks like through the liberal analysis of how change happens in the world. You know, there are people who are pulling strings, who are making deliberate decisions to distort how the political system functions. When in reality, if you look at this from a materialist perspective, then you understand that this isn't about somebody making deliberate decisions. This is about a competing set of conflicting material interests. And that's what he sort of touched on there, and saying, well, look, the rich might have got taxed a little bit more. We might have been a little bit more redistributive if the Occupy Wall Street moments, if the anti-austerity movement in this country from 2010 onwards had been stronger, and it wasn't divided, as Gary so eloquently put there, by getting people to fight amongst each other by race rather than by class. So there's a really important understanding there that this is not being done because there is an evil person in the background deciding to make it happen. Elon Musk is evil, of course, but the idea that he's doing things for his own material interest is treated like a conspiracy rather than the natural reaction to a entirely over-marketized economy where all that matters to people is their own material circumstances, you know, where we look at the people who've maintained all this wealth, who've created all of this wealth in their own hands, rather than having it distributed for the benefit of all of society. And in a world where we've taught people that greed is good, I think, well, I've got to protect this. I have to make sure that my net worth stays as high as possible. And so that's a material interest of theirs to maintain that. So they want to push back by ensuring that there is a political movement that stops any amount of distortions to how they want to maintain the wealth that they've accrued through this current economic system to try and halt that change. That's not a conspiracy. That is just people looking after their own material interests. That is the nature of the conflicts under capitalism, you know? So it's not a conspiracy to be able to claim that that's happening. And I'm glad that James O'Brien is starting to recognize this. It's interesting that just after the American election, he was like, I was surprised. He was very surprised to find out that the main thing that was driving people towards Trump was how expensive petrol was, rather than, the state of American democracy. And that's because at the end of the day, material conditions matter. But it doesn't just matter for people on the bottom, it also matters for people at the top as well. Their material interest is extracting as much wealth as possible from the proletarians who they take surplus value from. And any way to change that through extra trade union bargaining or higher wages or through higher taxation going into the public realm has to be pushed back. And they will fund media to do it, which will also manufacture consent for policy against trying to ensure that there is a more equitable distribution of resources in our society. And that is just the natural result of the system as it is. And so you have to change the system rather than trying putting better people at the top or trying to change the way in which we narrativize it. You have to make sure the system changes. And as Gary has correctly put, that involves class solidarity. That involves building a coalition of people with the same material interests and trying to get them to unite under that banner without being distracted by the ways in which the people who have the other set material interests from dividing and conquering, which has been part and parcel of history. I mean, they literally did this in the Americas, in the United States of America, when they ended slavery. There was a deliberate desire by the bourgeois in American society to push the narratives around racial narratives. So it's rather than there being common cause between the recently freed slaves and the working class proletarians within American society at the time, but they should have class unity. They are now part of the same class, having slavery been ended. But there was plenty of propaganda that was successful to try and pit the white working class people against the black newly freed slaves. And this is the same kind of racist narrative that we see being parroted right now to try and stop there being class unity. And that's the job that we have here on the left. As what Gary Stevenson talked about in the podcast episode that we just watched there, is trying to make sure that we go past the cultural distractions of what's being pushed by the anti-immigrant sentiment from the right and try and speak about material class unity and class consciousness, and that, as far as I'm concerned, should be our main mission moving forward.
Completely 100% agree with you. And yeah, I think what you said there about sectorial bargaining as a mitigating factor to offset possible negative effects of migration in some small areas is exactly right. And in fact, it's something that Jeremy Corbyn understood, because sectorial bargaining was such an important feature of his vision of workers' rights in this country. And we've just had the workers' rights bill from Angela Rayner, and that has been removed because sectorial bargaining is a way of building solidarity. And therefore, it has to go. It's too dangerous. And of course, we saw what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, who was an extremely effective builder of solidarity amongst Britain's working class. As you say, that when you're talking about well-funded, media-driven campaigns, if you want an object lesson in how that works for taking someone down, you just have to look at what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. And James O'Brien was very much a part of that. Okay, Helena, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
An unusual Friday lineup, but an excellent one nonetheless. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I think it was pretty excellent too. But I am very glad it's the end of the week and the weekend. I'm sure all of you out there are as well. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Please do come back on Monday for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media.